Breaking news. Prigozhin versus Putin. Is Wagner too important to pulverize? Panic spread through Moscow when Wagner's forces began firing on Russian forces. Profitable business as usual resumed in Africa after the coup attempt failed and its leader was accused of treachery. Learn the ins and outs of podcasting with this comprehensive guide written by Piotr Sauer and Jason Burke. Vladimir Putin went on the airwaves to condemn the head of Wagner after Yevgeny Prigozhin's march on Moscow caused panic. Many people assumed Prigozhin was behind the treachery, and the subsequent threat to liquidate what was left of Wagner. Something subtler transpired in the days that followed. While Russian state TV has labeled Prigozhin corrupt and traitorous, our correspondent Piotr Sauer tells Noshin Iqbal that he has been invited for a face-to-face meeting with the Russian president. Meanwhile, Jason Burke notes that Wagner's expanding footprint in Africa sends a clear message of business as usual to regimes that rely on it. The Guardian's editorial board makes its own decisions. And we're committed to maintaining universal access to our reporting. We rely more and more on the support of our audience to keep the lights on. While Barack Obama's ability to deliver rousing speeches to large crowds was a powerful political tool, the most consequential words he ever spoke were spoken in private. In reference to Joe Biden's potential nomination as the Democratic Party's candidate in 2020, Obama famously warned a fellow Democrat, "Don't underestimate Joe's ability to FK things up." The former president's assessment of his vice president cannot be reasonably contested. From the border to the economy to the spike in crime under Biden, it's clear that he was spot on. The situation in Ukraine also provides evidence, albeit in a different way, that Obama is correct. Proof that even when Biden gets the big policy right, he still manages to FK things up. As evidence, consider the president's recent statements on Ukraine's NATO membership bid and his administration's convoluted justification for sending cluster bombs to the Ukrainian military. Any failure to execute on a critical component of the project will undermine the entire endeavor and put at risk public support for an expensive foreign policy. At a time when the United States is racking up a $1.5 trillion deficit, a German research firm estimates that American aid to Ukraine reached $75 billion in May, making it the country's largest recipient of foreign aid. Biden was correct in his initial assessment that NATO should help Ukraine fight off Russian aggression. He realized the invasion posed a threat to international stability and knew that preventing Russia from entering Europe was the alliance's primary mission. Even though the smart money was on Vladimir Putin's tanks and army to execute a modern blitzkrieg, divide up its former satellite state, and take what it wanted, he went ahead and did it anyway. As has been the case for decades, some European leaders were eager to appease Putin. Thankfully, it became clear that the Russian army was a lot less capable and well prepared than had been assumed. The courageous Ukrainians' ability to hold their ground was due in no small part to Biden's leadership in mobilizing NATO's military and financial support. But ever since that promising beginning, the president's tendency to pull a defeat out of the teeth of a victory has repeatedly reared its ugly head. His repeated refusals to approve more advanced weapons for Ukraine's aid were followed by reluctance to do so several months later, resulting in delays that cost our ally lives and territory. Biden's hesitance on providing Ukraine with artillery, tanks, and fighter jets was counterproductive to the plan of giving Ukraine enough oomph to send Putin packing. Despite the enormous cost of maintaining the status quo, Vice President Biden has always seemed unconcerned about whether or not the allocated funds are actually being used as intended. Even though over $30 billion and counting has been allocated to general categories of humanitarian aid and financial support, little tracking of where the money actually ended up has piqued his interest. Simply put, this means that the people of the United States are funding the salaries of corrupt government employees, maintaining the electricity supply, and who knows what else in a country with a well-deserved reputation for graft. Biden's latest blunder occurred on Sunday, just before he jetted off to Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, to attend the NATO summit. CNN's Fareed Zakaria brought up the age-old question of whether or not Ukraine should join the alliance, and Vice President Joe Biden said it was premature, and Ukraine was not ready to join. It was an unexpected response, given that this was ostensibly going to be a major topic of discussion at the summit. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, for one, seemed caught off guard and blasted his most important funder and other NATO members, which is highly unusual behavior for him. There were signals that certain wording is being discussed without Ukraine, he said in a long, smoldering tweet on the way to Vilnius. I also want to stress that the focus of this language is the invitation to join NATO, not Ukraine's membership in the alliance. It's completely unprecedented and ridiculous that no deadline has been set for either the invitation or Ukraine's membership. He went on to say that Moscow would be encouraged by the slap to keep the war going indefinitely, and that Ukraine would be isolated as a result. To be fair, Biden has reason to be wary of accepting Ukraine as a member during the conflict. Doing so would likely activate Article 5, which states that an attack on any member is an attack on all. But that's old news, so it's at least puzzling that Biden and other national leaders gave Ukraine the impression that the summit would pave the way for membership when they really meant something entirely different. And Zelensky is likely correct that Putin will be emboldened to keep the war going after such an embarrassing rejection of his request. The White House has condemned Russia for using cluster bombs against Ukrainian civilians, but Vice President Biden has defended sending them to the country. Cluster bombs have been banned in most countries but not the United States. Each bomb releases 72 grenade-style explosives over a large area, some of which may not detonate for years and continue to cause collateral damage. Even more interesting than the weapon itself is Vice President Biden's defense of the United States' decision to send it. He informed Zakaria that the Ukrainians were running out of a particular explosive, adding, and were low on it, so cluster bombs were a transition. Oops. It would be foolish to reveal the location of our ammunition supplies, but so was the policy that led to this predicament. I wrote about historian Niall Ferguson's concerns for our own military supplies back in February when I reported on his trip to Ukraine to assess the situation. He stated on Dan Senor's podcast that the military-industrial complex has withered away. The amount of resources we've used up in Ukraine and the time it will take to replace them is shocking. According to Ferguson, one effect was weakening our defenses against a possible Chinese attack on Taiwan. He said it was a strategic error, that the United States had failed to realize that China is the bigger beneficiary of the aid to Ukraine and that all the tough talk about defending Taiwan is from an alternate reality. The United States ammunition supply is running low, and Vice President Biden has finally admitted it publicly, after only 5 months. Why didn't the president anticipate Ferguson's prediction? Please alert the president.